All right, ready to dive deep into Henry Sidgwick. Maybe not a household name like, say, John Stuart Mill, but a huge figure in ethical theory.
Yeah, Sidgwick's interesting. He wasn't so much about telling us what's right or wrong, but more like obsessed with the how. Like, how do we even figure out moral judgments?
Right, almost like meta-ethics before anyone called it that. We've got excerpts from his major work, The Methods of Ethics, and some background from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So for someone who's into philosophy already, what's the angle that makes Sidgwick stand out?
For you, it'll be how Sidgwick tackles this tension between three big ethical viewpoints: egoism, intuitionism, utilitarianism. Doesn't just make them fight, he tries to find the rational core in each one.
I did notice how embedded he was in the intellectual world of his time. Not just some solitary scholar, huh?
Not at all. Born in 1838, spent almost his whole life at Cambridge. But not some ivory tower guy. A huge champion for education reform, especially for women. Instrumental in setting up Newnham College, one of the first for women in England.
That's pretty forward-thinking for the Victorian era.
Definitely. And challenging the status quo wasn't just about women's education for him. Pushed for modernizing the whole university curriculum, including stuff like modern literature, natural sciences. Even resigned his fellowship at one point, couldn't subscribe to the Church of England's 39 articles in good conscience.
Sounds like a man of principle. Let's get into The Methods of Ethics, his most famous work, I guess. Not exactly a light read, though, is it?
Dense, yeah, but rewarding. Came out in 1874. Massive effort to systematize different approaches to ethics, like a comparative anatomy of moral reasoning.
So not preaching one moral code, but exploring how we even think about morality.
Precisely. Now, he was heavily influenced by utilitarianism, the whole greatest happiness for the greatest number thing, but he took other views seriously too. Intuitionism, for example, the idea that we just have this innate sense of right and wrong.
Okay, so this intellectual buffet of ethical theories. How do you try to bring them all together?
He identifies three main methods of ethical thought. First one, you've got egoistic hedonism, sometimes called rational egoism. Maximizing your own happiness, that's the ultimate goal.
I think we've all dabbled in that one, right?
Yeah.
What's the next method?
Next is intuitional morality, going with those basic moral rules, duties, the things we just accept. Don't lie, keep promises, all that.
The fundamental ethical building blocks. And the third?
The third is universal hedonism, essentially utilitarianism. Still about maximizing happiness, but not just for yourself, for everyone.
Three very different ways of looking at morality. Sounds like he was trying to find some underlying connection between them, some common thread.
He was, and this is where it gets really interesting for a philosopher like you. Sidgwick argues that both egoism and utilitarianism, even with their differences, can be justified by reason.
Wait, so acting totally out of self-interest and acting for the benefit of everyone can both be logically sound?
That's the heart of it. Leads him to what he called the dualism of practical reason.
Dualism. So two opposing forces.
Exactly. Trying to reconcile self-interest and the demands of morality. How to be rational and good, seemingly impossible task.
So did he think ethics was just inherently messy, irrational?
He grappled with that possibility, even considered weakening his own super strict standards for moral knowledge or bringing in a theistic god to resolve this conflict, a god who makes sure doing good lines up with your own happiness eventually.
Fascinating. And I understand Sidgwick had some pretty diverse interests outside of ethics.
He did. Economics, political theory, even parapsychology.
Mirror psychology.
Yeah.
That's unexpected. Like investigating ghosts in ESP.
You got it. And his interest in this seemingly unrelated field was actually connected to his struggle with the dualism of practical reason. But we'll get into that later.
Okay, this is already pretty mind-bending.
Yeah.
Can we take a step back and talk about those high standards for moral knowledge that Sidgwick was known for? He had some specific criteria for achieving certainty in ethical beliefs.
Yeah, four main conditions. Kind of like a philosopher's toolkit for evaluating if any moral claim is valid.
Let's break those down. What was the first condition?
Clarity and precision. Your ideas need to be sharply defined, no room for vagueness.
Makes sense. You can't build a sound ethical system on fuzzy concepts. What's the second condition?
Careful reflection. You can't just go with what feels right in the moment. Your beliefs have to stand up to serious scrutiny, critical analysis.
Challenge those gut reactions. Really think things through. What's the third?
Consistency. Your moral beliefs can't contradict each other. If they do, that's a sign to go back to the drawing board.
Right. Internal logic is key. And lastly,
consensus among experts. This one might seem a bit controversial, but Sidgwick argued that the more agreement you find among thoughtful, knowledgeable people, the more likely it is that you're on the right track ethically.
So it's not just about what you personally think, but about finding common ground with other great minds. That could be a powerful tool for refining and validating ethical ideas.
Exactly. Now, even with these rigorous criteria, Sidgwick never claimed to have all the answers. Actually, his deep dive into ethics led him to confront some pretty profound uncertainties.
So even with all his intellectual firepower, Sidgwick still ended up wrestling with those big unanswered questions about morality, the nature of good and evil.
He did, and that's part of what makes him so interesting. Wasn't afraid to face the complexities, even if they led to more questions than answers. He didn't shy away from them, those tough spots. It's actually what makes his work so compelling.
Okay, so we've got this brilliant guy, reform-minded, wrestling with huge questions about morality, exploring utilitarianism, intuitionism, even getting into the paranormal. A lot to unpack. For someone who's already studied these areas, how does it all fit together in Sidgwick's work?
You really have to look at the context of ethical thought back then. Victorian England, utilitarianism was dominant. Thinkers like John Stuart Mill.
Right, the focus on that greatest happiness for everyone.
Exactly, but there was also a strong current of intuitionism. Thinkers like William Whewell, the Cambridge moralists, they argued for a more innate understanding of right and wrong.
So Sidgwick steps into this heated debate, trying to find a middle ground, or at least make sense of these seemingly opposite views.
Precisely. He wasn't just taking sides. He was dissecting each approach really meticulously, analyzing the strengths, the weaknesses, ultimately trying to reconcile them.
Okay, but how did he actually go about doing that?
Well, he starts by defining each method super carefully. For example, with egoistic hedonism, he's not talking about some crude, go grab every pleasure kind of thing. It's more about a rational, long-term calculation, what truly maximizes your well-being.
So less about indulging every whim, more about making choices that lead to, like, a flourishing life.
Exactly. Then, with intuitional morality, he makes this distinction: dogmatic versus philosophical intuitionism.
Interesting. What's the difference there?
Dogmatic intuitionism, that's like your common sense morality.
Yeah.
The basic rules, the duties we just kind of accept without too much thought.
Don't lie, don't steal, be kind, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But Sidgwick argued that while this is useful for everyday stuff, it's ultimately too limited. These rules, they clash sometimes. They don't always give clear answers in complex situations.
You need something more robust to navigate those ethical gray areas.
Exactly. That's where philosophical intuitionism comes in. This is about identifying the deeper principles, the ones those common sense rules come from or are justified by.
Like searching for that philosophical bedrock our moral intuitions are built on.
Exactly. And Sidgwick, he was a master of analysis. He really digs into the different contenders for those foundational principles.
That must have been fascinating for him, exploring all those great ethical thinkers. And this is where his approach really shines, right?
It does. That rigorous comparative approach is what makes the methods of ethics so groundbreaking. He's not just pushing his own pet theory, he's taking the reader on a journey through different ethical systems, making you think critically about your own assumptions.
And earlier, we touched on the dualism of practical reason, that tension between egoism and utilitarianism. How does that play out in the book?
As Sidgwick dissects each method, he kind of lays bare the challenges, the limitations of both egoism and utilitarianism. With egoism, he acknowledges there's a strong argument for self-preservation, pursuing your own happiness.
Makes sense. That drive to look after yourself, it's powerful.
It is. But Sidgwick also saw that we're not just isolated individuals, we're social creatures. Empathy, compassion, these things motivate us to act for others, even if it means some personal sacrifice.
Right. We see that all the time. People sacrificing for loved ones, for their community, even strangers.
Exactly. And this led him to really explore utilitarianism. He was impressed by that emphasis on impartial consideration, maximizing happiness for everyone.
But it wasn't like he just fully embraced it, right? Utilitarianism has its own issues.
Of course. Sidgwick had his critiques. Can we even accurately measure happiness? Are all pleasures equal? Individual rights, justice, can those always be reconciled with maximizing the overall good?
Those are the classic objections. The trolley problem, for example. That idea of sacrificing individuals for the greater good. Those dilemmas really make you think about your values.
Absolutely. And Sidgwick, he doesn't shy away. He acknowledges utilitarianism has a noble goal, but yeah, there are serious practical and philosophical problems.
So did he ultimately choose a side? Egoism or utilitarianism?
The fascinating thing is he didn't. He concludes that both have strengths, both have weaknesses, and there's no easy way to definitively reconcile them.
He was comfortable with that tension, that uncertainty.
In a way, yes. He even suggested that this unresolved conflict might point to a fundamental limitation of human reason itself.
That's a pretty bold statement, especially for a philosopher who devoted his life to, you know, clarity and understanding.
It is. It speaks to his honesty. He wasn't afraid to confront the limits of his own knowledge, admit that even with rigorous analysis, some questions might just stay unanswered.
But he wasn't just resigned, right? Didn't just give up.
No, not at all. He saw the challenges, but he also believed in progress. Through careful thought, open dialogue, a real commitment to truth, that's how we can get closer to a more ethical, meaningful understanding of the world.
It's not about having all the answers, but about engaging in the process, grappling with these big questions.
Precisely. And that's a huge part of Sidgwick's legacy. He pushes us to really think about morality, to question our assumptions, to never stop striving for a more ethical way of living.
And we mentioned earlier his interest in parapsychology, which seems pretty far removed from ethics.
His religious journey is interesting. He moved away from traditional Christianity, but he never stopped searching for meaning, for purpose in the universe.
Okay, this is where I'm getting a little lost. What does ghost hunting have to do with all this deep philosophical stuff?
Remember that dualism of practical reason, that conflict between egoism and morality. For a philosopher like you, this is where Sidgwick gets really interesting. He was troubled by this possibility, that acting for the greater good might actually go against your own happiness, that virtue might not be rewarded in the end.
So he was looking for some cosmic reassurance that doing the right thing would ultimately pay off.
In a sense, yeah, he was drawn to this idea of a benevolent God, one who makes sure the universe has moral order, that people who act ethically, they'll find happiness, fulfillment.
I see. So parapsychology, for him, it was a way to explore this idea of a spiritual reality, something beyond the material world, a place where those ethical aspirations might actually be justified, have a basis. He was trying to bridge reason and faith, maybe even find some evidence for that worldview.
Exactly. It was an unconventional path, for sure. But it shows his relentless curiosity, willing to explore anything in his search for truth.
Okay, so deep interest in the big questions, willing to go down some unusual paths. But he was also a man of action, right? Involved in educational reform, shaping intellectual life at Cambridge. What were some ways he put his ideas into practice?
His involvement in educational reform, it was a natural outcome of his ethical, philosophical commitments. He really believed in knowledge, critical thinking, open-minded inquiry, crucial for individuals, for society to progress.
So for Sidgwick, it wasn't just theorizing from some ivory tower. He wanted to empower people to live more ethical, fulfilling lives.
Precisely. Education, that was a key tool to achieve that. Championed wider access to higher education, especially for women, advocated for a more modern, inclusive curriculum, reflecting the changing intellectual landscape.
I bet that was pretty revolutionary back then.
It was. He believed that universities, by cultivating intellectual curiosity, rigor, open-mindedness, they could become engines for social and moral progress.
And it wasn't just formal institutions, right? He was also involved in those intellectual societies, the discussion groups, so common in Victorian intellectual life.
Absolutely. He saw those as vital spaces for debating ideas, challenging assumptions, having a more informed and nuanced public conversation.
He really embodied that public intellectual ideal, not just thinking alone, but engaging with the world, trying to make a difference.
He did. And it's that combination, the intellectual depth, the commitment to social progress, challenging conventional thinking. That's what makes Sidgwick such a fascinating and influential figure.
We've covered so much,
Yeah.
from the different ethical systems to his work on economics and politics. For a philosopher, those areas might seem a bit outside the usual scope.
Sidgwick, he applied that same rigorous analytical approach to everything. Economics, politics, he was influenced by John Stuart Mill's work on political economy, but he went beyond it. Engaged with a bunch of thinkers, developed his own nuanced views on things like market regulation, social welfare, the role of government.
So not just some detached theorist.
No way. He saw economics and politics as inherently connected to ethics. The way we organize society, our economic systems, those have huge implications for people's well-being.
It's like he was anticipating some of our current debates. Individual liberty versus the common good, the role of government in markets, the ethics of economic inequality.
He was a keen observer of his time. He recognized the massive social and economic changes happening, industrialization, globalization. He wrestled with the ethical challenges that came along.
So how'd he approach those? Did he have specific policies he advocated for?
He did. We talked about educational reform, how important that was to him, empowering individuals, creating a more just society. He also argued for government intervention in markets to address poverty, worker exploitation, environmental damage.
So not a fan of that hands-off capitalism.
No, he saw that unregulated markets had problems, believed government had a role to play in making a fairer, more humane system.
And his overall political views.
Deeply committed to democratic principles, but acknowledged the dangers of a tyranny of the majority, importance of protecting individual rights. He was also a big advocate for international cooperation, a more peaceful world order.
So a complex thinker, understood the challenges facing society, both in his time and looking ahead.
Exactly. He tackled tough questions, challenged conventional wisdom, and proposed bold solutions.
Okay, we've covered so much. Ethical systems, economics, politics. For a philosopher, what do you think is the most significant part of Sidgwick's legacy? What are the key takeaways?
One of the biggest things he contributed, it's that rigorous, comparative approach to ethics. He didn't just present his own theory, he made you confront all these different ethical perspectives, analyze the strengths, the weaknesses, develop your own more informed understanding of morality.
He was all about critical thinking, encouraging people to question their assumptions, to push for deeper understanding.
Exactly. And his legacy extends beyond ethics. He brought that same rigor, that open-mindedness to economics, politics, everything, always pushing the boundaries of inquiry.
And even though he wrestled with uncertainties, even admitted the limits of reason, he never gave up on searching for truth, for a more ethical world.
Never did. He believed that through careful reflection, open dialogue, dedication to knowledge, we can get closer to a world where individual flourishing and the common good aren't at odds.
That's a powerful message, especially today as we try to deal with this complex and challenging world. Let's dig a little deeper into some specific areas where Sidgwick's work still feels relevant, where his insights could guide some of our current debates.
Let's start with his take on utilitarianism. He was critical, sure, but he was also drawn to it. That emphasis on impartial benevolence, on maximizing happiness overall.
Right? Striving for that greatest good.
Exactly. And that principle, it's still hugely influential. Think about debates on animal welfare, global poverty, climate change, healthcare.
So even with the criticisms, those core utilitarian ideas are still with us.
Absolutely. And Sidgwick, with his nuanced take, his understanding of the strengths and the weaknesses, he offers really valuable guidance. He reminds us that aiming for the greatest good is a noble goal, but we got to consider the potential costs, the trade-offs, make sure individual rights and justice aren't sacrificed in pursuit of that overall happiness.
That's a crucial point. It's easy to get caught up in maximizing happiness in the abstract, but we can't ignore the real world, the impact on actual people, actual communities.
Exactly. Sidgwick provides a framework for thinking through these tough ethical dilemmas, balancing competing values as we work towards a more just and ethical world. He reminds us making ethical choices, it's not about blindly following some rule, it's about careful deliberation, considering all the consequences, the implications of what we choose.
His work on intuitionism also feels really relevant now, right? That idea that we have this innate sense of morality, that some things are just self-evidently right or wrong, it's been influential throughout history.
Absolutely. And while Sidgwick was critical of what he called dogmatic intuitionism, he saw the importance of those moral intuitions, those gut feelings about right and wrong that we often rely on.
Right, those instinctive responses, often before we even really think things through.
Exactly. He argued that those intuitions, they're valuable, but we need to examine them critically. Test them against our wider ethical principles, our understanding of the world.
So not blindly following your gut, but using it as a starting point,
Yeah.
then refining it, shaping it through reason, dialogue.
Precisely. And Sidgwick gives us the framework to do that. He helps us understand what moral intuition is, to see its strengths and weaknesses, and to incorporate it into a more complete ethical picture. He reminds us that while our gut responses can be powerful, they can also be biased, shaped by our culture, even contradictory.
Balancing intuition with reason, examining those gut feelings critically. That seems especially important today, wouldn't you say? We're bombarded with information. It's easy to get caught up in emotional appeals, polarized debates. That ability to think critically, to step back and really look at our beliefs, it's crucial.
Absolutely. And Sidgwick, his work is like a timeless guide for navigating this complex intellectual world, for developing those critical thinking skills that are so crucial for making ethical political decisions. He reminds us the pursuit of truth requires intellectual humility, a willingness to question our own biases, openness to engaging with different perspectives.
It's a reminder to keep learning, to keep questioning, never stop working towards a more just and ethical world. I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot, but there's more to explore in Sidgwick's world.
Picking back up on Henry Sidgwick, it struck me he was all about this rigorous pursuit of knowledge, but also he was okay with some questions, just not having easy answers. Yeah, that's one of the things that makes him so interesting, especially for a philosopher. Fully dedicated to inquiry, but also humble enough to say, hey, even if we try our best, some things might just stay open. Some tensions, we might not fully resolve them.
That's a powerful lesson. This acceptance of uncertainty seems like everywhere you turn, someone's got the simple solution, the absolute truth.
Sidgwick reminds us that intellectual humility, that's a strength, not a weakness. It's realizing the world's complex, often multiple valid ways to see things. And our own understanding, it's always a work in progress.
So it's not about giving up on truth, it's approaching it with humility, knowing we have limits, being open to learning from others.
Exactly. And that kind of humility, it's not just for philosophers, it's for all of us. Especially in a world this complex, it lets us have real conversations, even when we disagree. Learn from mistakes, keep growing in how we understand ourselves, our societies, the whole universe.
And this isn't just some abstract idea, right? Sidgwick's work, it has a lot to say about ethics and politics, something a philosopher would appreciate.
Definitely. He saw ethics isn't just personal virtue, individual choices. It's woven into how we build our societies, our economic systems, how we use political power.
So he's pushing back against that classic liberal idea that politics is all about individual rights, self-interest.
He is. He argued that working towards the common good, a more just and equitable society, those are part of ethical life. Governments, they have a moral obligation, he said. Promote well-being of citizens, deal with poverty, inequality, injustice.
A more active role for government then, not just protecting freedoms, enforcing contracts.
Right. Government's a tool, a powerful one, to achieve ethical goals, to make a society where everyone has a chance to thrive.
That vision of ethically informed politics, that seems so relevant now. All the global challenges we face, climate change, inequality, polarization. We need ethical leadership, maybe more than ever.
You're right. Sidgwick reminds us that political decisions have ethical weight. How we structure society, distribute resources, those choices impact millions of lives. He's pushing us to look past self-interest, partisan politics, embrace a bigger vision, social justice, global responsibility.
And that emphasis on international cooperation, a more peaceful, just world order, that feels timely too.
It does. Remember, Sidgwick's writing in the late 19th century, globalization's on the rise, the world's getting more connected. He saw the potential for conflict, but also for cooperation, to achieve ethical goals, peace, justice, human rights. You need countries working together, a commitment to a more equitable world.
He was already thinking about the things we struggle with today, how to solve global problems together, build bridges across nations, across cultures.
He was. His work gives us a way to think about these challenges, to understand the ethics of global politics, the moral things that should guide us on the world stage.
So wrapping up our deep dive into Henry Sidgwick, what's the most important thing someone who's already into philosophy can take away?
I think Sidgwick challenges us as philosophers, as people, to be honest intellectually, to face the hard questions even when there are no easy answers, and to remember ethics isn't just some theory, it's about how we live, how we treat each other, how we shape the world around us.
He might not have given us all the answers, but he showed us how to ask the right questions. And maybe by engaging with those questions with that same spirit of inquiry, we can all find our own way towards a more ethical, more meaningful life.